all the things about, those early days of discovering static site generators and discovering kind of different ways of building websites. I haven't stopped liking any of it. I haven't stopped feeling excited about it.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. I'm joined today by Jared White. He's the lead maintainer of Bridgetown, a Ruby-based static site generator and freelance web developer. So excited to have him here today.
Thanks for having me.
Jared, what does Jamstack mean to you?
Just getting right into it.
Yeah.
Originally, when the term came out and it was all uppercase JAM, I kind of liked reversing that to MAJ because I would sort of then take folks on a journey of, first you start with the markup, and that could be like markdown files and HTML templates and all this different stuff, right? All these different files you have for your content. And then you figure out, if you need to talk to any external APIs, like pull down real-time data or, maybe talk to a database for certain things. And then use JavaScript, the J there at the end, to pull that information out of the API to give you those real-time updates. But everything kind of starts with the markup and the markdown and all these different template files.
So that's a good way to think about it. And a lot of people got confused with that acronym because they're like, well, does it mean I have to have JavaScript on my site to be Jamstack?
I feel like the era where it got de-acronymized, if that's a word, and just became Jamstack, then folks sort of only remembered the JavaScript part and thought, oh, Jamstack is these new JavaScript frameworks like Next and Nuxt and Gatsby and these different things. And like, that's what Jamstack is about. And I always felt like that was just one sort of wing of the overall world of Jamstack, but it certainly didn't need to be the dominant wing. But, we can go into reasons why maybe that happened. But it didn't make sense to me architecturally early on when it seemed like that was how things were trending. I just felt like, it's not really where it started, at least from my vantage point.
So what do you think it should mean?
It's hard to go simplistic maybe, but I will. I just like static site first being a way of thinking about things. I don't use Jekyll, of course, but the thing that was kind of fun about the name Jekyll was it had this, like sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing of like transformation. Like it has the little vial logo, not vial like ooh, but like the vial of the solution that you drink to transform, right? And it was all about this transformation. So, you start with all of these files and all these different, pieces of content in various formats, and image files. And you start with all that just on your file system in a repo. And then it transforms, magic, into a final website. And then you have that artifact, right? It's a transformed artifact that you can then deploy anywhere, host anywhere. It's kind of this universal just set of output files. So, I think realistically, most website projects won't end there, right? Unless it's just like a simple blog or something. But I think starting there kind of gets you on an architectural path that is really nice because you keep a lot of complexity at bay. It's like, I don't need a database until I need a database, right? I don't need this API or that tooling until I need it versus kind of the, old school web server approach to things. And believe me, like I've worked a lot in that world and still do, like say a Rails app. Like you can't even get a hello world Rails app until you've decided I need a database and I need this and I need that. And I'm going to have to think about job queues and I'm going to have to think about like all this stuff and how am I going to host this? And it's going to cost money. And, there's just a whole series of things you have to know about and learn and maintain, take care of with, these more elaborate frameworks. But to me, Jamstack is about simplicity and just starting really small, even for projects that will mushroom into something much more down the road.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think so much of modern web development doesn't follow that philosophy, and we just have layers of complexity to render, to your point earlier, a simple blog, when your life is just going to be a lot easier if you do that as a static website.
I mean, maybe, right? That kind of gets into the sort of the downsides potentially of where Jamstack sort of ended up, say a year or two ago.
Yeah, let's get into it.
At its pinnacle of, I don't know, awareness or something, because it ended up being all these things I thought we were trying to get away from at first. It ended up being like complex frameworks that require you to adopt a lot of tooling and a lot of decision making, and like even things that seem simple at first, like picking Next.js. Like you have to know you're going to work with React and build React components and kind of build things inside of this particular opinionated framework. And I just feel like it's hard to justify for a lot of projects why you need to choose that up front. Something I really admire about the Astro project, for example, is you grab Astro off the shelf and you can just kind of write some HTML and use their simple component format, and it's really locking you into much, then you can decide later, oh, I need React for this page. Okay, grab React for that page. And, oh, maybe we'll use Vue for some other thing because someone just came on board the team that's really good at Vue and they can build this other page. And you can have Vue. And, this islands architecture concept, it's so cool because you can have these different parts of your site load different technologies that are just for those parts of the site. And if you, as a user, don't go to that part of the site, you never load it, right? Like if I never go to the fancy form that uses React hook form and a bunch of stuff, like if I never go to that page, I never pay the penalty of downloading React and downloading the JavaScript that powers that particular form or whatever it is. So, projects like that, 11T has done a lot of work around islands architecture as well. Bridgetown, which is the framework I work on, takes advantage of the island is dash land web component that Zach worked on for 11T, but it actually works anywhere. So that's great. Anyway, yeah, I'm a big fan of islands architecture, and I think that is it slots really nicely into sort of the overall concept of Jamstack stuff. And so it's kind of unfortunate that some of the more famous like Jamstack frameworks just haven't been the ones that have popularized ideas like that help tame complexity and give you better performance and stuff.
So if we go down that idea for a bit, what started Jamstack on a trajectory that you don't really agree with?
I think whether intentional and unintentional, I mean, if I want to get real spicy, I would say kind of intentional. But I think there was a coupling of front end frameworks and what Jamstack delivers as an architecture. Like they start out, in my mind, fairly unrelated, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of the promise of the early days, whether it's Netlify or a few other services that came out, the promise was kind of, we don't care what language your static site generators run in. It can be Ruby, it can be Python, it can be JavaScript, sure. It can be like all these different things. We're language agnostic. And then serverless functions came along, and depending on the provider, that was also kind of language agnostic, or it was mainly just JavaScript. Either way, I think what really ended up happening is the front end focused JavaScript frameworks kind of jumped on that serverless bandwagon because it was an easy way to add, some dynamic elements to a framework that was otherwise just about sort of a spa, right? Like the static pages are almost nothing. It's kind of just a shell. And the worst version of that is like white. You just get a white page with nothing on it. And then the front end framework loads and everything happens. Like that's not a great architecture for almost any application, I would say. But we had that back in the early to mid 2010s. And so I think like that world kind of got mingled into Jamstack, and Jamstack became like, oh, Jamstack's the hosting infrastructure for spas and these large front end frameworks. And oh, the way we get around the white pages of death is we have some server stuff going on with these serverless functions to kind of, render stuff dynamically, but it comes from a server. So, so you get that HTML payload. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. It was like a whole bunch of sort of really unrelated things when you think about it, all kind of coming together in a confluence. And, developers are going to pick solutions that seem to work for them. So if you're a front-end developer and you've learned some JavaScript and people are telling you use React, and then people are saying, well, if you use Next.js, you can avoid white screens of death, and, host it on Netlify, they'll pre-render all this stuff, and or Vercel or whatever. Anyway, it was kind of like this marketing message that resonated with a lot of folks because they could get something up and running that makes sense. But I think in the long run, if you look at the web platform as a whole and you look at performance and you look at UX and really the U of user there, user experience, UX, and a lot of things, there's just been a lot of problems with that architecture. And I think, you look at what the React team is focusing on now with React server components, and like they get it, right? They kind of get it that we have to unwind some things and kind of go down a different path. And I think ultimately, like I like to crap on React server components for a bunch of reasons, but like I have to admit, like the intentions are good. Like the intentions are recognizing the reality of where we are on the web and having to really focus again on performance and on HTML first and on user experience. And, it's just kind of painful because it really is a reset of the React ecosystem. And arguably the reason React is great is because it's ubiquitous and everywhere. So if you're resetting the ecosystem in the middle of that, it's kind of painful. So, we'll see where it goes. Maybe we will end up in a better place down the road, but it's a bit weird right now.
Yeah, it is. So before you mentioned hitting those limits of Jamstack and then encompassing SPA and then serverless functions, what do you think would have been a better path? Like if serverless and a lot of these technologies were standardized, like that's kind of one path, or maybe Jamstack just draws a line and says, okay, that other stuff is useful for solving problems, but it's not Jamstack. Or is there another path? Like what path do you think Jamstack should have gone down?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm probably in the minority on this, but I kind of think Jamstack should really try to maintain server agnosticism as much as possible. So just not be very can't say that word. Not be very
prescriptive.
Like that's the word. About like what dynamic web servers look like in your architecture. So for example, if I'm building an old school Jekyll static site, right? That's all Jekyll can do. There's nothing else it can do but a static site. Maybe I also build a Rails API that serves up some real-time data or, does whatever. And my Jekyll site can talk to that. And I think, the Jamstack part is Jekyll and talking to this API, but maybe the API is kind of, just off in its own world a bit. And that's just kind of a traditional web hosting thing. So, you can call that whatever you want, right? But I kind of think of Jamstack as like you start with static sites, and then kind of the orbit of things around it could be any number of different things that we don't have to define as part of Jamstack. It can kind of
Yeah.
live on the periphery. And for some folks, some serverless functions are all they need. That gives them some features, and that's great. And if you want to say that's something that's part of some Jamstack sites, cool. I just think I think it was an unfortunate development to start with static sites and start with this sort of message around transforming assets, ending up with atomic deployment and these built artifacts. I think it was a mistake to start there, but then over time kind of get to a point where it's just like all this dynamic data flying around doing all this different stuff and serverless functions powering all these things. It feels like that's its own separate architecture, and that works for some people and totally doesn't work for other people. So it unnecessarily limits what Jamstack does as a descriptive term, as a teaching tool, as a community. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I agree with all of that. Like, I think if at that point Jamstack had just drawn the line and said, okay, there's these cool like new tech innovations happening, but they break the rules of core Jamstack, of pre-rendering and separating the back end from the front end. They're useful to augment a Jamstack site, and for many use cases, they might make sense. But it's not Jamstack, and that's okay. Not everything needs to be Jamstack. Jamstack has certain pros and cons. I feel like that would be in a better place if we kind of went down that route a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, if something describes potentially any type of architecture, then it describes nothing, right? And you could go the reverse direction too. Like, lots of dynamic web servers and sort of monolithic content systems and stuff have offered, aggressive caching systems where essentially you're serving a static site that's a snapshot of some moment in time because nothing's changed in a while. But, like if I grabbed, say, WordPress and hosted it somewhere really clever with a great crashing strategy where technically it's a static site most of the time, like it would be bait and switch to be like, oh, that's building static sites. That's a static WordPress is suddenly a static site generator. Like it's confusing the terminology and the sort of conceptual overview of what's happening to a point where it kind of becomes meaningless to talk about it anymore. So
and that exact use case, I feel like it highlights one of the problems of including serverless, because you have ISR, which is incremental static regeneration, and basically the way it works for anyone listening is the first request that comes in, it hits a serverless function or some sort of dynamic rendering, renders it, and then from then on, it's purely static. It's exactly the same as a static website. But to your point on the WordPress with an aggressive cache is basically the same thing, except you have the server running all the time. So like if we include ISR in Jamstack, then it's another small step to get WordPress with an aggressive cache in there, and then you keep taking these small steps onward and onward, and now everything's Jamstack.
Yeah, you start like coming from completely different ends, and then it kind of all starts to become this big ball of architecture in the middle, and everyone kind of claims to be offering sort of the same features, just kind of coming at it from a different starting point. And yeah, it becomes hard to reason about. And I've seen this, like I've been on teams where, we're using Next.js, we're hosting on Netlify, but nobody really understands how any of it works. Like if you asked any one person, like, is this URL a static page or a dynamic page or being client side rendered? and you need JavaScript or everything's blank, or like which parts of the page are blank until JavaScript kicks in. Like nobody knows.
Mm.
Nobody knows. And I don't even really realize what's going on until I run into some problem of like something happened with the JavaScript. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, this like whole half of our page is just completely missing unless the JavaScript kicks in because of some particular way that part of the React tree was written. And it just gets hard. It gets, otherwise very smart, very capable people just don't know what's going on in
Mm.
the architecture. And that's what worries me. So,
Yeah, especially when Jamstack was about simplicity, and now we have that.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of, any frameworks or tools that are, trying to take away foot guns and trying to simplify and kind of be like, you know, like we have the sharp knives here to build something ambitious, but you really need to know what you're doing at that point. And we kind of, you know, if not technically, at least in the documentation, warn you like, don't go here unless you really need this and you need it set up this way. Um, I would love to see a lot more of that in the industry of just, provide these happy paths right away that are truly as simple as possible and really help steer beginners in good directions for performance and for good UX. And the DX will be good as well. Like I think it's a
yeah,
bit of a dichotomy sometimes when people talk about DX versus UX, and I feel like good frameworks provide both simultaneously. That's how I'd
mm.
phrase it, and
Yeah.
one reinforces the other.
Mm. So, how do you think Jamstack remains relevant, or should it remain relevant?
Well, I think it should remain relevant. All the things about those early days of discovering static site generators and discovering kind of different ways of building websites. Um, like I haven't stopped liking any of it. I haven't stopped feeling excited about it. I mean, the Bridgetown framework has evolved to allow server side rendering and database access and different things that you can set up. But most of the time, I'm still just writing markdown files and you know pushing something up through GitHub, and something gets built, and then that's it. If I don't push anything up again for a few months, like that's great. Like it's just
Yeah,
gonna hum along on a basically free service somewhere. And I just think that's great. I mean, I still have some client projects I've worked on in the past where like a year, 2 years can go by with nobody touching anything, and the site is just running and it's just accessible to the public and it's fast and it doesn't really cost anything basically. I mean, it's incredible. So I think, if you look at the architecture of the web itself, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, image file assets, etc., um, Jamstack's kind of the easiest way to get there, right? Like
yeah,
if I, as a web developer, want to throw together some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and throw it up somewhere and see it stick for an indefinite period of time, like Jamstack's the way to do it. So
yeah.
I'm happy
Completely
with it.
agree. Yeah. So, what do you think about the name? Do we stick with Jamstack and redefine it and put bounds on it and try and get back to some of those core ideas that I think at least the initial community formed around, or does it have a lot of baggage now and we need a new term and a fresh start?
Well, you know, what's that cartoon about, there are 14 competing standards and someone's like, "Well, write one more standard that
Yeah,
encompasses all of them." And now you have 15 competing standards. I kind of feel like at this point, like either we use the term Jamstack and kind of reimagine it, or you know, sort of do the retro thing and go back to what we most like about it, or we just kind of let it go and just talk about like web hosting that works for some particular framework or some particular language, and it is whatever it is. I don't know. I think most people that really got excited about Jamstack early on probably feel like, why can't we just do that? And I do feel that way too. So I'll throw my hat in the ring, I guess, to say, yay Jamstack. I think that term was a rallying cry for a lot of different people to kind of come together and work on some different stuff together and get excited about that. And um, that seems more valuable than kind of just letting it fade away.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the one I would be a fan of that. The one issue I can see is like there's still a lot of people who define Jamstack as JAM, and like everyone I talk to is somewhere on the spectrum of that definition, and it's like, can we get everyone back to a certain point of time? And there'll be a certain portion of the community, right, that is like, that's not what Jamstack means to me. I like all my serverless functions and dynamic rendering. Um, yeah. Do you think that would be an issue, or it's kind of faded enough now that any resurgence of it is a fresh start?
Well, I mean, it does kind of seem the the most sort of JavaScripty heavy duty framework type communities that would be on that spectrum of Jamstack. Like they're not really pushing the term anymore, it seems, and
Yeah.
like I just don't hear people describe like Next.js is a Jamstack framework or Nuxt is a Jamstack framework.
It's
I don't
true.
know. I feel like they found their roles as being, this is for React folks, this is for Vue folks, and I think that's how people themselves probably think of themselves. Like, I'm a Vue developer, I'm a React developer, I'm an Angular developer, and so these are the frameworks for those tools, and JavaScript as a language. So so if that's the case, I think it frees the term up to kind of go back towards more of an agnostic, like, this isn't about any particular language, this isn't about any particular framework, it's about an architectural approach to building websites. At least that's my hope, right? I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. So in that world, is Bridgetown a under that umbrella? How do you see that fitting in?
That is a good question. I'd have to think about it, because early on, yeah, like right when I started the project in 2020, I was saying, it's a Jamstack framework, right? It's a Jamstack site generator, blah blah blah. And when I, pretty quickly saw right at that moment in time, kind of this shift for a while, I got bummed and kind of took off all the Jamstack marketing from the Bridgetown site. But now if it's kind of being taken over again by folks in the community and kind of getting rescoped a bit more narrow, but also brought at the same time in terms of being language agnostic and different things. Yeah, I could see putting the Jamstack label back on the Bridgetown site and being like, "Yay, the party's back. We're doing this." That'd be
We're
cool.
back. Yeah. Um,
Back by popular demand.
yeah. I love it. That's a good note to finish on, actually. Yeah. Like, I think if that's really where we're trying to get to, is that the frameworks that think about static sites first, I feel like, should be the filter. then that's in the Jamstack world. And if it's like dynamic-y or serverless or whatever first, then it's cool, but it's not Jamstack. I think that's a good distinction. Yeah. Nice. Jared, thanks for joining today. This is a great conversation.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's fun. I appreciate talking about this, and I really appreciate the efforts you've been putting in to like really dive into these topics. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. I enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.